The Russian government has introduced drastic new measures to clamp down on dissent as opposition to the war is growing among Russians. On Friday morning, the parliament passed legislation banning the spread of information critical of Russia's war or Russia's military. Violations could carry up to 15 years in prison. Free speech advocates are warning this will dramatically increase censorship. Earlier, the country's media watchdog restricted access to DW and some other international media websites. And earlier this week, the popular Ekho Mosvky radio and the independent Dozhd TV channel were also shut down. Now let's bring in DW Russia correspondent Emily Sherwin on this, normally based in Moscow. But since the Kremlin shut down our bureau there and revoked accreditation for all our colleagues and journalists there, you're working from Berlin. It's good to have you in the studio for a change. So let's talk about this new legislation by the Russian parliament. How significant is this?
Well, it's very drastic. It essentially means that all criticism can be silenced, and the fear that already existed, even before this war in Russian society is being solidified. So even this, just last week, the media watchdog in Russia was warning that media outlets in Russia can only use official sources to report about what they're calling a special operation. They also were telling critical media outlets that they can't call a war, but that they should be referring to it as a special operation. Now it seems with this new law, which means up to 15 years in prison, essentially for anything that veers off the official line, that essentially makes critical media impossible. I know a lot of foreign colleagues as well, foreign journalists, are thinking whether it's even safe for them to stay in the country
at the moment. Does it apply to foreigners as well?
Well, it applies to anyone spreading information. Foreigners included, and also social media posts could be included. So essentially anyone posting about the war, criticizing the war, spreading any information about the war online at all, on Facebook, on Instagram, and so on, could face, quite a drastic punishment. And we've seen that before as well, that these laws can be applied to social media as well.
Well, basically this ban is there to stop dissent inside the country. We're getting a different picture here in the West. How big is the potential for dissent in the country right now?
Well, it's hard to know because, of course, it's hard to trust polls at the moment. There has been an official poll from a government pollster which says that around 66% are in favor of this war. Independent experts that I've been talking to put that number at more like 50%, which is still pretty high. And it shows you that a lot of people do turn to official sources of information, especially in times when they're afraid, when they're unsure. People start watching State TV. And of course, the line there is that Russia is liberating Ukraine from the neo-Nazis, and that this is a non-violent operation almost, where they're not hitting civilian targets at all. So that's the current line there. And I've heard from, people that I'm talking to on the ground, friends as well, who are saying that they can't actually talk to their parents about this anymore because there's a huge generational divide, of course, in how people consume media. People who are younger consume media more online. Others, older people, often watch State TV. So people are saying, I can't talk to my parents anymore because they're saying that everyone in the West is Nazis. They're saying, don't be a traitor and so on. So really quite upsetting things that you're hearing from Russians on the ground as well about that.
So Russia made it more difficult to get uncensored information right now. But how can get people in Russia? It's still possible to get uncensored information, but it's more difficult, right?
Exactly. At the moment, it's still possible. Russia does, of course, have the possibility to cut its own internet off from the World Wide Web. Experts are saying that that's still quite unlikely and could be technically difficult, but that's a danger. People are using VPN services, which means that they can essentially hide their IP addresses and pretend they're in a different country in order to access information that would be blocked within Russia. So they can access critical media outlets. You were mentioning that, Medusa was being blocked, a critical media outlet, the BBC, DW, many others as well. But it's an effort. And, the question is whether people will continue to try to find information, especially in a situation where they're confused and upset anyway. That's a danger. People are using Telegram messaging services as well to get, their channels on there with news as well. But it's getting harder and harder, and I expect that to continue as well in the coming days.
Let's talk about the rumours that martial law could be introduced in Russia. Is that realistic, and how would the Russian public react to that?
I would say that at this point, almost anything is realistic when it comes to repressive measures within the country. We've seen repressive measures now. I think anything is possible. We don't know what the introduction of martial law would mean in practice. Apparently, there's quite a broad range of measures that could be introduced, but it could mean border closures, mobilization, and even more censorship, essentially. And a lot of people are currently trying to leave the country because of these rumors. There are reports that there's a huge demand for flights to leave the country, especially to countries where there is no visa measures for Russians so that they could actually stay there.
Many one-way flights, actually, right?
Many one-way flights as well, and I'm hearing this from friends who are trying to find a way out. Of course, not everyone, as I was saying. And as people wait to figure out what's happening, of course, the sanctions are biting as well. So one person was telling me they had around $10,000 in savings to try to leave the country. Now that money is worth $5,000, and that's getting worse and worse, of course, as the ruble is in free fall as well.
Many thanks. Our Russia correspondent Emily Sherwin there. Thank you, Emily. And you're watching DW's special coverage of Russia's war in Ukraine. And here's a little summary of the top news this hour. Ukrainian officials say Russian forces have seized the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the southeast of the country, which produces about 1/4 of Ukraine's energy. Russian troops launched an attack on the facility overnight, leading to a fire at the plant, which is also Europe's largest. Ukrainian emergency services managed to put out the fire and secure nuclear safety. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency has confirmed that there has been no radioactive leak. Russian troops are in control of the site, but Ukrainian staff continue to operate the plant. And following the attack, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky again called for a no-fly zone to be imposed over his country.
I felt that the world's leaders were shocked. The United Kingdom is calling for an emergency UN Security Council meeting due to this attack. The International Atomic Energy Agency is launching an investigation by their Centre for Emergencies. It has gone in full 24/7 response mode. We need immediate toughening of sanctions against the country, the nuclear terrorist. We need immediate closure of the sky over Ukraine. This is the only guarantee that Russia, at least, will not strike with rockets and bombs targeting nuclear plants.
Volodymyr Zelensky speaking there. And for more, I'm now joined by DW's Terry Schultz at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Terry, President Zelensky there again calling for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. How likely is that?
There's a lot of admiration for President Zelensky here at NATO headquarters and in capitals, along with admiration for the bravery of the Ukrainian citizens fighting back against the Russian onslaught. At the same time, NATO leaders genuinely don't believe that a no-fly zone would de-escalate this crisis. They point out that, at some stage, a NATO plane would have to shoot down a Russian plane, and that would lead to World War III, people are worried. They say that they try to explain to their Ukrainian counterparts that this would not be good for Ukraine. At the same time, many of these leaders are speaking quite frequently to President Zelensky, and I'm sure those are very uncomfortable conversations because he does seem to truly believe that this would be a way to save his country. And at the moment, this is just not something NATO is seriously considering.
Zelensky also suggested this conflict in Ukraine could spread to surrounding countries. Are those concerns being taken seriously at NATO there?
Absolutely, they are. You've seen that NATO has reinforced its own eastern flank. The Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, all of them have extra troops coming from the United States, coming from Germany, extra equipment. So that's what they're doing to protect their own territory. But there's also increasing concern about other countries, Moldova and Georgia. They're along the borders with Ukraine, where Russia, in fact, has stationed troops already in some of these regions. In Transnistria, they've, occupied a couple of regions in Georgia, and there is concern now, and we're hearing this more in recent days from NATO officials off the record, that Russia could push forward over the borders with Ukraine and try to meet up these troops that are stationed in other countries. So there's a lot of concern, both about the fact that he may make a mistake and actually touch a NATO country, but also that he may try to take over more territory in these vulnerable neighbors.
Terry, one more question. Do you get the impression that NATO is ready to counter any threat to its territory, as Zelensky has indicated?
Certainly, NATO feels that it is ready to counter any Russian threat to NATO territory. It has stationed more troops there, more equipment, and it has tens of thousands of troops that could be brought to the ready if necessary in this 40,000-strong NATO rapid reaction force, of which they've only deployed a few hundred at this point. So certainly NATO has been backfilling its own capabilities just in case. And, at the same time, you really don't hear that leaders think that Putin would gamble this, would actually touch NATO territory. And still, we've seen so many things in this attack on Ukraine that nobody thought made sense rationally. So nobody is taking anything for granted anymore, and they will be continuing to discuss how to additionally reinforce NATO's own eastern flank.
DW's correspondent Terry Schultz there at NATO headquarters. Thank you very much. A reminder for viewers who've just joined us now, Ukrainian officials say Russian forces have seized the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the southeast of the country that is responsible for about a quarter of Ukraine's energy production. Russian troops launched an attack on the facility overnight, leading to a fire at a training facility on the grounds, but not the reactor building. The complex is Europe's largest nuclear power plant. Ukraine's State Emergency Service says it managed to put out the fire and secure nuclear safety. Authorities say that radiation levels remain unchanged. Rafael Grossi from the International Atomic Energy Agency addressed the situation at the plant a little earlier.
It's important to say that all the safety systems of the 6 reactors at the plant were not affected at all, and that there has been no release of radioactive material. I have indicated to both the Russian Federation and the Ukraine my availability and disposition to travel to Chernobyl as soon as possible, so that these 7 crucial pillars are never again.
Let's get some background to that incident. Joining us now from Vienna is Gauhar Muhadjanova. She's a nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament specialist. So, given what we know so far, how dangerous was that incident?
Hi. Well, this is an unprecedented situation. So the truth is we don't really know how dangerous this could get. But as Director General Grossi pointed out, and you mentioned earlier, the fire was at a training facility, not at the reactor building itself. So that's sort of the good news, to the extent that there could be good news in this situation. So the fire has been put out, and the reactor presumably is safe, all the reactor units. And one must note that these are reactor units with built-in safety systems tested against high impact. So this is not cause for panic yet, but certainly for very serious concern.
Let's just for a moment think about how dicey it is to have a war fought near a nuclear power plant. If a grenade from a tank or an artillery shell would hit the reactor building, would that lead to a radiation leak straight away?
Not straight away. The reactor core is protected, and the newer generation power plants and cores are tested for safety to withstand very high impact crashes up to sort of an airplane crashing into the reactor building. That said, there are other dangers if there's fire on site, if the safety system fail, and especially if the electricity supply and the backup supply is cut off, then we have the situation where there is no way to cool the reactor core, even if it's shut down, if the operation stopped, and then we're looking at the risks of reactor meltdown. But it won't be caused by just one grenade being thrown at the reactor building.
So, strategically, can Putin now switch off the lights in large parts of Ukraine, and could that have been the strategic aim of this attack?
I cannot tell if that was really the strategic aim, or if that sort of happened in the fog of war, general fighting, and the reactor site is hit. But yes, Ukraine's electricity supply depends on nuclear power plants. About 50% of the electricity in Ukraine is generated by nuclear power plants. And so we have Zaporizhzhia right now, only one reactor unit is operational at only about 60-70% capacity, according to what the Ukrainian regulator reported. I hear that other power plants are being shut down preemptively, so that could have serious implications for the power supply for civilian facilities in Ukraine.
Is there a safety protocol in place for nuclear plants in conflict zones? I mean, what happens if a war breaks out around nuclear power plants in general?
Well, again, this is unprecedented. There's nothing we can refer to in terms of former practice. There's no treaty obliging states not to attack nuclear infrastructure, but there have been general conference resolutions at the International Atomic Energy Agency highlighting the need not to attack nuclear installations. So certainly it's part of the sort of international norm not to target operational nuclear facilities, but we don't have any specific treaty regulating that. That said, the International Atomic Energy Agency operates an incident and emergency center, and right now it went into sort of round-the-clock operation to provide assistance to Ukraine.
Nuclear non-proliferation expert Gauhar Muhajanova in Vienna. Thank you very much for joining us here on DW News.
Thank you.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has joined other world leaders in condemning Russia's attack on the nuclear power plant. He was speaking at the alliance's foreign ministers gathering for a special summit on the war in Ukraine.
We condemn the attacks on civilians, and over the night we have also seen reports about the attack against the nuclear power plant. This just demonstrates the recklessness of this war and the importance of ending it, and the importance of Russia withdrawing all its troops and engaging good faith in diplomatic efforts.
And I'm now joined by Egon Rams. He's a retired German army general, former NATO commander in Europe and Afghanistan. Mr. Rams, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is one of many calling for a no-fly zone over his country to be enforced by NATO. Do you think NATO would be willing to do that and risk a military confrontation with Russia?
I do not believe that NATO is willing to do that. And from my perception, with regard to the legal situation, it is not allowed to do that. If NATO would press through the no-fly zone over Ukrainian air or Ukrainian territory, that would be a participation in the war, and that would lead to a possibly direct confrontation with the Russians.
So, do you think there's consensus between NATO political leaders and NATO military leaders on this issue?
I do hope so, and I believe it strongly, because I believe that all political leaders and all military leaders know what the legal framework is in such a case, and that would be that NATO would be involved in the conflict and in the war, and that is something which is not foreseen and not planned for the time being. What we are doing right now, what NATO is doing right now, is to protect our allies along the borders between the allies and Russia and Belarus. You know that we have reinforced the forces in Lithuania, in Estonia, that we have sent some additional fighters to Romania and to Poland. So from that point of view, NATO has done what is possible for the time being to show Russia that NATO is willing to defend NATO territory.
So what is the greatest concern right now for NATO leaders?
I'm not a NATO leader anymore. However, the major concern may be, very cautiously from my side, that there are one or the other unexpected reactions from the President Putin towards NATO, as he has done it during the last weeks or months, I would like to say, always claiming that NATO is violating the interests of Russia, which is not the case. We all know that NATO has been founded in 1949, and NATO has never started the war. NATO is only placed in those countries and in all NATO countries to conduct defense if necessary and required. And even the changes we have had during the last, I would like to call it 8 years since the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula, is all directed for 360-degree defense of NATO territory and nothing else.
Now, President Zelensky is saying that Ukraine is only the beginning, and Vladimir Putin will move on to other Eastern European countries that are in NATO. Lots of old files and folders with NATO contingency planning being dusted off right now in Brussels.
I believe, and that is something which has been done by Secure. Secure has activated, I would like to say, the first plans with regard to contingency plans which are available and have been established during the last 6-7 years. So from that point of view, NATO, from my perspective, is well prepared for that. And the forces NATO has for such cases, like the NATO response force, I would like to say, in a higher alert status, so that they would be able to react if required.
So should that scenario that Zelensky there hinted at, should that come into place, how well is Germany's army, the Bundeswehr, is it able to play its part?
With regard to the NATO obligations Germany has taken, the answer is a clear yes. If you are talking about the VJTF, if you are talking about the NRF, Germany is prepared to participate in those things with the number of soldiers, the number of aircraft, the number of ships, as it has been promised by Germany for the year 2022 and 2023. You know that one of our brigades is preparing to be the main part of the land forces for the VJTF 2023.
General, have you thought that you in your lifetime would ever experience a situation like this?
No, that is something I could not imagine. Simply said, it is something which is going to happen where things are completely turned. I just would like to mention that Mr. Putin claims for Article 51 of the United Nations Charter as a kind of defense, whereas no defensive actions required or necessary for Russia. They have started the war against Ukraine, and now they are talking about a kind of defense which is, from my point of view, so unserious that is unbelievable. Perhaps an additional remark on the subject. I can very good understand the reactions or the feelings, I would like to say, which may be in the Baltic states like Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, because I have spent a lot of time in these areas and participated some years ago in a study which has been made concerning the Suwalki Gap, so that they have fears against the Russians is something which is very, very understandable, and that makes it even difficult. But I still believe that Mr. Putin has something in his head which is still a little bit working to avoid such a situation and to escalate to a direct confrontation with NATO.
Retired General Egon Rams, former NATO commander here in Europe. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And I'm now joined by our correspondent Matthias Böllinger. He's in Lviv in western Ukraine. Matthias, intense fighting continues. Where do things stand across the country right now?
Yeah, we've just heard the latest news. There are many hotspots at the moment. Kharkiv and Kiev remain some of the most of the worst attacked or cities where we have the worst damage also to the civilian population. Shelling is going on there. Mariupol is encircled. We don't have a lot of news from there because the city is mostly cut off any communication as well as electricity and gas supplies. So this looks very dire there. Here I am now at near the train station in Lviv, and this is one of the places where many refugees arrive, and we are hearing a lot of very sad stories. We are seeing people coming in still from Kharkiv. There are trains evacuating people, but we also see the people fleeing from places that have so far not been attacked, like Dnipro in the east or Odessa in the south, where the Russian army is advancing and where people are afraid of fighting. In Odessa, people have said they could already hear some fighting, although it seems to be still quite far away from the city. So fighting is intensifying across the country. It's a very dangerous situation now for many people here.
Matthias, what are you hearing from the capital, Kyiv? People there have been bracing for a full Russian assault for days.
Yeah, we've seen fighting around in the suburbs of Kiev for quite some time now, for many days, almost since the beginning of this invasion, and it seems to be continuing. There is a warning by the authorities that the Russians might try to encircle Kiev and lay siege to the city. So far, they have not managed to enter the city, or at least not deeply. They have entered and then were fought back. Fighting continues in the northern and northeastern, northwestern suburbs of the city. Shelling, of course, of the city has also happened and is happening. So the situation is pretty much it's volatile, but it has not shifted yet. In general, things are going on. It's still unclear what is happening. Of course, this is a city that the Ukrainian forces will try to defend very hard. A lot of forces, as we understand it, have been brought into position there even before the war. It's, of course, the most likely target of a Russian attack. It's been since the beginning. So, of course, this is a very crucial moment for the capital.
Now, Ukraine and Russia held another round of talks on Thursday. They agreed on humanitarian corridors for people to leave. Tell us about those.
There is a general agreement on humanitarian corridors that might be corridors for people to leave, or that might be corridors to bring in supplies, food, for example, or medication. They are, of course, needed, especially in those cities that are under siege, like Mariupol and Kharkiv. We know now here from the refugees that there are still ways out of the city, but of course the city has been mostly cut off from many routes in and out of the city, and there is a need, of course, to supply the city with humanitarian goods.
Matthias Böllinger there reporting from Lviv in western Ukraine. Thank you, Matthias. Meanwhile, the exodus of people fleeing the war continues, mainly women and children, as most Ukrainian men are required to stay behind and fight. Poland is receiving the biggest number of refugees, but other neighboring countries are also taking in people desperate to escape. DW's Tessa Walter reports from the Slovakian border with Ukraine.
A roof over their heads, even if it's just a tent, and a hot meal. Here in Vyshne-Niemieckie, Slovakia, they've found shelter from the attacks of the Russian army in their homeland. Oksana arrived here from western Ukraine just a few hours ago with her 2 children. I was so afraid for my children. We had to flee. All of us had to flee. I don't know what to do now. Oksana is relieved that she's safe here for the time being, but she still can't comprehend the whole catastrophe of the war. I don't want to call myself a refugee, I want to go back home, where my children were happy. I want to... I'm just so scared. Lydia also just made it across the border with her children. She's afraid for her husband, who can't be with his kids right now, but has to fight the Russian soldiers. We are all worried. But what should we do? My husband told us to go, and then we went. We may never see each other again. This is not right. If we all have to die, we want to die together. It's not right that my husband is in Ukraine and we are here. You don't want to leave your home. Like Lydia and Oksana, thousands of women and children are fleeing Ukraine for neighboring countries. The families here are trying their best to hold up. Especially the mothers do all they can to shield their children from the horrible situation they are in. But when you speak to them a little bit longer, you realize just how traumatized they are by the war in their home country. Marian Letzo is one of the volunteers who takes care of them.
They are sad. It's not very surprising because yesterday they had normal lives and today they are here in Slovakia, and I believe they didn't plan to come here, so it's different for them. They have different lives now.
For now, they can only wait until their feet will be on solid ground again.